The most common measure of output is gross domestic product, or GDP. This measure sums the value of all the final goods and services produced in a country. For instance, in the second quarter of 2014, U.S. GDP increased 6.4%. That's an increase of $267.3 billion, putting America's GDP at $17.3 trillion a year. That's more than double the output of the world's second largest economy, China. China's GDP is $8.2 trillion and grew 7.5% in the second quarter of 2014. At current levels, China is set to become the largest economy in the world in just a few years. In fact, it may already have become the largest. How? While GDP measures only the level of output, it does not factor in the cost of goods and services for individuals. If you have ever tried parking in New York City, Boston, or San Francisco, you know it can easily cost more than $30 per hour. Yet, in rural towns, there's no charge to park anywhere. The cost of rent, food, clothing, and even healthcare may also be less in rural towns as compared with urban centers. In like manner, the cost of things differs from country to country. This difference is accounted for in a measure known as purchasing power parity, or PPP. PPP adjusts the level of GDP to account for what things actually cost in local terms. For instance, when adjusting for PPP, the GDP for China moves from $8.2 trillion to $13.4 trillion. This is significantly higher than its nominal GDP. On the other hand, in Finland, where goods and services are very expensive, the PPP adjusted GDP moved to $194.2 billion as compared to the $250 billion GDP, highlighting that things are really expensive in Finland for the same level of income. While GDP is the most common measure of output, it has several criticisms. First, it counts all output produced in a country but fails to account for the ownership of the assets. Why does this matter? Because the owners get the wealth created by the country. For instance, if all the factories in a country were owned by foreign firms, GDP would be very high, while all the profits of production would likely be sent back to the foreign owners, and the wealth of the local laborers would be low. Thus, gross national product, or GNP, measures the output of a country but takes into account who owns the production. Output that is produced by citizens of that country count for GNP no matter where in the world they are produced. So if Honda owns a car production plant in Ohio, the output from the plant would be counted in the U.S.'s GDP, but in Japan's GNP. Similarly, Ford's plant in Germany would count towards Germany's GDP, but the U.S.'s GNP. Second, some argue that GDP, or GNP for that matter, are overly focused on goods and services and miss the more important measure of individual well-being. As a result, several other measures, such as the UN's Human Development Index or Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index, have been developed. These measures focus more broadly, including things such as environmental, physical, mental, workplace, social, and political well-being. The reality is that there is often a high correlation among the measures, whether it's GDP, GNP, Human Development Index, or Gross Happiness Index. So while the differences in the measures can reveal important nuances, the general patterns of output, wealth, and well-being dominate. An additional important step in evaluating the economic productivity of a country is looking at who is consuming the output. This partially determines what types of opportunities are available in different countries. We take this more detailed look by parsing out the GDP into consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NE. If a country has a big C, level of consumption, relative to I, investment, and G, government, then we know there is a big opportunity in consumer goods, and knowing the consumer's needs and preferences are paramount. If the country has a large I, then the country may have a political climate that supports investments with human capital, R&D equipment, and the like. Operating in a country with a large G will likely require a positive relationship with the government, and building government ties is key. A country with a large level of NE is an exporting country and may be a great place to export from. A country that imports more than it exports, like the U.S., is open to foreign goods or at least is reliant on foreign oil. In sum, it is useful to parse the GDP into where the output is consumed to get a more fine-grained understanding of opportunities inherent in a country.